So yeah, I'll just quickly run through good publication practice and GPP 2022 and what that means for Asia Pacific, and talk about some exciting things that are on the horizon that perhaps Blair and Jonathan could also pitch into later on as well. So these are my disclosures. So what is good publication practice? And I think all of us here really know what it's about. So when we're considering the publication of company-sponsored research, transparency and accountability are the key priorities. And so good publication practice provides a framework to uphold those principles through ethical publication planning, ensuring that the design and results of clinical trials are published accurately and in a timely and transparent manner. So what are the key issues with regards to the good publication practice? Well, the issues are mainly related to publication bias and data transparency, as well as the engagement of professional medical writers and the relationship between industry and external investigators and authors. So firstly, the issue of transparency. So in the past, many papers have been written without reference to the funding sources or the degree of assistance provided to prepare the manuscript, as well as disclosure of competing interests. And there is also now an increasing drive for full transparency and sharing of study data. So manuscripts of clinical trials submitted to ICMGE member journals are now required to provide a data sharing statement indicating which data, such as a study protocol or CSR, will be shared, where those documents are available and for how long. And the second is the issue of authorship. So have the authors of the paper contributed sufficiently or provided a substantial intellectual contribution to the development of that manuscript to qualify as authors. And then finally, the role of financial support. So there needs to be transparency in who has provided the sponsorship and financial support of the studies from the either industrial or academic institutions. So why do we need guidelines? So there have been quite well publicized practices previously that really eroded trust in pharmaceutical sponsored research. And so the profession is growing, and it does need guidance on how to publish in a consistent and ethical and responsible manner to help us get beyond the previously publicized issues around ghostwriting, plagiarism, lack of access to data, guest authorship, among many other issues. And so guidelines can help restore public trust in reporting medical research, and they help reinforce the standards of excellence in peer-reviewed publications, and they help us establish an unbiased framework, and as well as best practice standards. And the guidelines can also help us direct ethical, accurate, complete, and transparent reporting of that medical research. So looking specifically at the good publication practice guidelines, I mean, there are a number of other guidelines that we all refer to, so particularly the ICMGE guidelines on authorship criteria, COPE guidelines on ethical publications, WAME. But I think the GPP really helps provide a practical guidance for publication professionals to ensure the ethical and transparent reporting of clinical research. So GPP has been evolving over the past 20 years. So started with the first iteration in 2003 by Liz Wager, published in Current Medical Research and Opinion. That followed by GPP2, which was an industry standard for a number of years back in 2009. And then GPP3 really opened up, provided a much broader framework for us to work from back in 2015. And that was developed during a time when the industry was under a lot of scrutiny and provided some really robust principles that we can work from. And so GPP2022 was released or published in August 2022. And that was conducted under an extensive consultation process and provided updated guidance on the ethical publication process and as well as transparency, and also took into account the evolving field we're working in and provided guidance on some emerging publication tools that really do reflect our current environment. And it's also been restructured to provide more practical advice for teams working in publication planning and delivery. So why was there a need for these new guidelines? The GPP3 was really quite comprehensive and had some very core underlying principles that we were able to work from effectively. But there is certainly recognition that our industry is evolving very rapidly, and the pandemic has obviously accelerated some areas even more. And so these latest guidelines are designed to recognise some new areas of focus, as well as to update pre-existing areas from GPP3. And as I mentioned, GPP3 was designed to really help develop a framework of ethical publication planning to demonstrate, to provide a guidance to work from to show that professional medical writers can be accepted as partners in the development of medical publications. And because the industry was under attack at that time. But now there's an increasing focus on data disclosure and clinical trial transparency within industry-funded research. And so that has taken a lot of the focus away from the role of professional medical writers. And I think full transparency and acknowledgement of the role of professional medical writers in the development of publications is becoming an increasingly accepted part of our profession. So there is now more freedom for us as medical publication professionals to set the terms of the discussion in the context of transparency. So how do we use the GPP guidelines? It's important to understand the GPP guidelines, GPP2022, should be considered as an ethos, not as an SOP in itself. So we need to approach every situation as being unique and approaching it also with the best ethical intent, which can be guided by the GPP recommendations. The GPP steering committee, they work to ensure that the guidance provided in GPP22 is much more practical and is also in line with the principles recommended in GPP3 and GPP-CAP, which is the Congress Abstracts and Publications Good Publication Practice Guidelines, which also follow similar principles to GPP3. So GPP22 should not be considered as an SOP. They're more designed for use as a training and communication tool. So you can take individual supplement sections. It uses infographics to help impart information to teams more readily, and writers can use these sections to communicate with authors more clearly about roles and responsibilities as well. So the key principles of GPP22 are essentially the same as those of GPP3, including the reporting and publication of biomedical research should follow all applicable local laws and guidelines. All biomedical research should be published in peer-reviewed journals in an accurate, balanced, and timely manner. And the integrity of the research and the data must be protected from commercial influence. So all authors must also have access to the relevant study data and to be accountable for the work. And in many cases, it's important to develop steering committees or working groups prior to data being available and having a full understanding of the roles and responsibilities of the members within that committee, within that publication group, decided up front. And of course, all funding sources and other interests of the authors or sponsors must be disclosed. So I've highlighted here that some additional principles in GPP2022, which really do reflect a changing landscape of our industry. So one key update is the role of patients and patient advocates, and they should be included in publication planning and development where appropriate. In particular, this may be applicable for research in rare diseases, where there is a very strong patient advocacy landscape. Publication should also support communication of scientific information to lay audiences, so that through the development of plain language summaries. And we should be looking to for open access journals or free to access articles wherever possible, to facilitate the free access and open reporting of science globally. So that's a very important principle that coming out from the new updates from GPP22. So more broadly, the GPP22 reflects, sorry, excuse me. So building on the previous guidance to reflect the changing role of us as publication professionals, and strengthening the values of ethics, transparency, inclusivity, accountability, and responsibility that are core to good publication practice. Some key updates include updated guidance on the types of studies that should be published, such as health economics outcome research, real-world evidence, and translational biomarker studies. And as I mentioned, there's more information on the role of patients as authors. There is improved and more detailed guidance on authorship agreements, and we can discuss this later, but this is quite an interesting update, is the removal of the recommendation to limit author numbers, which is in line with the ICMJE guidelines, but it would be good to discuss this, particularly in the context of APAC. Other updates include more guidance on working with alliance partners, advice on the role of social media in publication planning, and again, further guidance on enhanced content and plain language summaries for publications, which is something we are seeing more and more of in our day-to-day work. And there is further clarity on the timing of data sharing to help improve transparency with publications. One key aspect of GPP22 is the detailed supplement, which contains a lot of very practical advice and guidance on the key aspects of publication planning. So on different types of publications, publication working groups, our role as publication professionals, and our own professional development. Different guidance on publication plans, documentation, authorship, and authorship contribution determination as well. And there has been a lot of work within ISMAT to develop algorithms and more guidance around authorship determination. And again, this is something that we can look forward to discussing further, because this is something that can be considered an issue in APAC. There's also guidance on developing steering committees. That's also something that could be seen as quite novel in the Asia-Pacific landscape. So there's some very useful guidance in GPP22 about that. So in terms of GPP22 versus GPP3, so these are the key themes that differentiate both. So I mentioned that there are updates in regard to the ICMJE changes, specifically the removal of the limit on authors. So the GPP2022 discourages limiting based on the number of people in the functional area, but I do recommend following journal and conference guidelines with relation to any author limits. And authors are required to negotiate decisions about journal selection and author order. So there also a key theme of developing a unified style, the GPP22 recommends developing a unified publication policy to cover all biomedical publications capturing ethical principles, including data sharing statements, timing of publication for individual data sets within different programs. And so it really provides some practical guidance on developing that unified style for the entire publication planning process. And I mentioned earlier that also guidance on working with patients, and that patients and patient advocates should be regarded as experts who can provide an important input into publication planning, either as and development, either as consultants, authors, or contributors. So in terms of the enhanced content, that's certainly encouraged by GPP22, particularly plain language summaries, and also video and audio materials to increase accessibility. The development of enhanced content should adhere to GPP principles, and all material should be reviewed and approved by authors. Preprints, we've seen obviously a massive increase in the use of preprint servers during the pandemic, which allowed rapid dissemination of crucial data. The GPP22 recommends avoiding preprints of clinical trial data, particularly pivotal randomized controlled trials, unless required for urgent medical situations or if the journal requires them, but it does recognize a value. So in terms of SOPs, so GPP provides more guidance on practices for steering committees and publication working groups, and provides updates on processes for developing enhanced content and guidance on developing SOPs around that. But as I mentioned earlier, the GPP2022 should not be considered as an SOP in itself, but more as a practical guide to help inform that with your teams. So turning now to good publication practice in APAC. So we know that there are a lot of common issues with applying GPP in APAC, and this is something that has been consistent throughout my whole experience of working in this region. But and I'm sure many of you are quite familiar with these particular issues in terms of the lack of author participation, lack of author input, guest authorship, too much input from industry, or too many authors. And again, we can discuss that. And the list could go on, but it's important to recognize that some of these issues are really relating to differences in communication styles, which we need to recognize, particularly with authors who may not use English as a native language. So, because we use English for medical publications, that speaking in English or providing feedback in English may be a considerable barrier for authors who do not have English as their first language. So we need to look at ways in which we can adapt our own communications and our own way of working with those individuals to help improve these processes. And Blair and his colleagues, it's very good to see him on the call today. They developed specific guidance relating to the principles of GPP3 that could be applied to the Asia Pacific region, and this paper provides practical guidance on applying the 10 principles of GPP3 in Asia Pacific, recognizing the cultural barriers and different cultural expectations and different ways in adapting communication styles and practices. It also provides specific guidance on core publications and applying the ICMG criteria at the time. I hope we can discuss this further. I know that there will be, there are initiatives in place to develop further guidance on applying GPP 2022 in the region. So I look forward to discussing that later. So I think the recommendations that Blair and his colleagues made are still relevant. Now, I shan't go into too much detail, so I think we could provide, again, a lot from our discussions, but just to emphasize a couple of things. So the principles in APAC are still relevant, and that clinical research relevant to populations in Asia Pacific should be published in a timely manner, ideally in English to maximize accessibility. All authors should be made aware of any relevant local laws that apply to their research. When we're looking at encore presentations, so these are quite common in our region, so they're very important, and we should be looking to present encores that may be considered of high regional interest that have not been made readily accessible to local audiences. So encore presentations are certainly encouraged. So the publication of clinical data specific to this region or to different countries within Asia Pacific should be planned in advance to limit any delay in their dissemination. And so we should be looking to collaborate and engage between the different partners involved within and outside the Asia Pacific region to ensure that regional data, local data are published in a timely manner. So looking at further principles, all authors should be made aware of the contribution required to meet all 4 of the ICMG criteria before starting work on publication. Now, that may involve us actively working with authors to make them aware of their roles and responsibilities. So sponsors or professional medical writers, we may need to look at providing authorship agreements in a language that the authors can understand. And allied to that, particularly in this region where face-to-face engagement is, or face-to-face interaction is really known to improve engagement. Informally approaching individual authors in advance of developing that publication can help to ensure that they understand their roles and responsibilities, and that conversation may be required in a native language. So I just want to highlight this particular principle, and again, this is something that many of you would recognize as a challenge in your daily work. Sometimes authors may not provide any comments on the review process and just say that yes, they approve the document, but it's important that we can follow up with authors that don't have any comments, and that they should clearly communicate that the publication has been thoroughly reviewed, even if they do not have any comments on that manuscript. And to facilitate that, we may need to look at ways to develop novel methods of engaging authors. As mentioned, really looking at meeting up with them face-to-face and finding out what their preferred way of working and preferred communication style is, to really help ensure that they have reviewed that work fully and they understand their roles and responsibilities as authors. And that should be supported through communicating in their native language where possible. And so looking at the author contributorship, so that may be a challenge to identify clear and specific contributions for authors. So providing a list of potential contributions in a native language can help us to record their contribution more accurately and help us draft contributorship statements. Disclosure can also be a challenge, and we need to encourage transparency regarding any relationships or potential competing interests. And allied to that, defaulting to authors having no conflict of interest is not recommended. And so we need to ensure, again, adapting our communication style to help extract any disclosures from authors through potentially through face-to-face discussion if needed. So looking ahead then, we already have pre-existing guidance on GPP3, but there's a lot of updates from GPP2022. And at the ISMAP annual meeting next month, Blair and Jonathan are leading regional focused publication planning workshops, which is very exciting. So I would encourage you to, if you are members of ISMAP, to access the post-meeting materials, or if you are going to the meeting, to head to these workshops. It's really quite exciting to see that we are finally getting a platform on a global stage, because for many years the issues that we see in this region are not really well recognized globally, and so these workshops provide some great understanding of some of the issues we see in this region as well as other regions globally. So I know that for some of you who work in other regions where English is not the native language, there are similar issues in relation to communicating with authors. There are also poster presentations on implementation of global guidelines in APAC, as well as a poster on author feedback, language preferences, and the results of these studies are really quite enlightening, and they can help us factor into our own publication planning processes and communications, and different ways in which we can work with authors in this region. So I look forward to seeing those posters again, led by Jonathan, and I know that Henry and others on the call have worked on those posters, so I look forward to seeing those. And I believe that Blair is also working on providing further guidance on applying GPP2022 in APAC, and there are also translations in development for Chinese and Japanese versions of GPP2022. So I'll just mention briefly about ISMAP itself. ISMAP does provide a lot of resources to the region. So there's a quarterly Asia Pacific ISMAP U webinar. There's lots of other global webinars and podcasts and resources that ISMAP members can access. Of course, there's resources on best practices and guidelines. So the GPP 2022 can be found on the ISMAP website, job board, and also there's ISMAP online community forum, which is it's a great forum to network with people and to help resolve specific issues that you may have. You can also obtain the Certified Medical Publication Professional credential if you have been working in publications for a number of years, and that's a really a strong foundation for demonstrating your credentials as a medical publication professional, and it's certainly seen as well respected within the industry. There are lots of different ISMAP meetings, the ISMAP annual meeting, as I mentioned, the ISMAP European meeting held at the beginning of the year, and there are also Asia Pacific meetings as well. Further details will be available shortly. And of course, as a member, you have access to all of these resources following the meetings. So on that note, I will open the floor to any questions, and hopefully it's a good discussion.